The studio was unusually electric that night. Something about the atmosphere felt heavier, more unpredictable. Jimmy Fallon had planned for a light-hearted evening filled with nostalgia and laughs, but the energy in the room shifted the moment Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, yet behind their cheers was an undercurrent of curiosity. Eastwood, stoic and intense as ever, took his seat with a measured calm that seemed almost too calm. Fallon greeted him with his usual smile, but something in his eyes hinted that he already sensed the night might veer off script. The conversation started harmless enough. Jimmy asked about Clint's new film, a Western drama that explored themes of legacy, regret, and aging. Eastwood responded with his signature brevity, offering insights that were more philosophical than promotional. But Fallon, ever the entertainer, couldn't resist teasing Clint about his old-school values. With a smug grin, he pivoted into a question about whether Eastwood thought Hollywood was leaving people like him behind. The audience chuckled at the setup, but Eastwood didn't. His face didn't flinch, his posture didn't shift. Instead, his voice dropped slightly, and with eyes like ice, he countered. It was not just a disagreement, it was a rebuke. He dismissed the implication that his time had passed, asserting with calm ferocity that the world didn't need more voices pretending to stand for progress while silencing others. The crowd's laughter died immediately. Fallon, taken aback, chuckled awkwardly, trying to steer the ship back toward humor. But Eastwood wasn't playing along. Then came the moment that changed everything. Fallon leaned in, narrowing his eyes just enough to let his irritation seep through. He accused Eastwood of being stuck in the past, of romanticizing a version of America that no longer existed. It was intended as a jab, but it struck a deeper nerve than he realized. Clint didn't blink. Instead, he began to speak slowly, deliberately, as though measuring each word for its ability to cut through the noise. He called out Fallon's show for being part of the problem, for pushing shallow jokes and hollow virtue while avoiding real conversations. He painted Fallon not as a host, but as a mouthpiece for a sanitized version of culture that punished dissent. There was no yelling, just truth delivered with surgical sharpness. The silence in the room grew louder than any laugh track could hope to cover. Jimmy's face tightened, his jokes evaporated. He tried to regain control, interrupting Clint mid-sentence with a sarcastic remark. That was the moment things snapped. Eastwood's voice, now raised for the first time, carried a gravity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. He didn't just defend himself. He dismantled the illusion that Fallon's charm could hide his cowardice. Clint accused him of hiding behind applause and never standing for anything that mattered. What followed wasn't a back and forth. It was a public reckoning. Fallon, embarrassed, fired back by calling Clint bitter, saying he had outlived his relevance. The audience gasped. The sound of shifting seats and awkward coughs filled the gaps where laughter once lived. Jimmy's words were cruel, but Clint didn't flinch. He let the insult hang there like a rope Jimmy had just tied around his own reputation. As Eastwood leaned forward, the lights above seemed to cast a sharper shadow on his face. With startling calm, he made it clear he didn't come to entertain Fallon's vanity. He came to tell the truth. And in that moment, the tension that had simmered beneath the surface for years between two drastically different worlds, old-school grit and modern performance, was finally boiling over. The silence following Clint's words lingered like smoke after a fire. Jimmy Fallon sat frozen in place, his rehearsed expressions replaced by something unfamiliar: uncertainty. The audience, typically quick to rally behind their charismatic host, was now fragmented. Some looked on with concern, others with fascination. It was no longer just an interview. It was a battle of identities, generations, and the ever-widening chasm between sincerity and spectacle. Jimmy broke the silence first, but the effort to recover his charm was strained. He forced a laugh, trying to pretend the moment hadn't already tipped too far, but his voice betrayed the tension. He accused Eastwood of bringing negativity to a show meant for laughter and connection, subtly framing himself as the victim of an unexpected ambush. But the crowd didn't laugh with him. Clint, unmoved, sat in perfect stillness, studying Jimmy as if measuring the depth of a man who had made a career by avoiding depth. Then Eastwood leaned in again, and the studio chilled. His voice was calm but commanding, accusing Fallon of hiding behind the idea of positivity to avoid addressing the rot beneath the surface of popular culture. He described a world where truth had become uncomfortable, and discomfort was rebranded as hate. And in that world, men like Fallon thrived, because they never risked saying anything that mattered. The crowd grew more still. The show had turned into something no one had expected to witness. Jimmy, visibly rattled now, abandoned all pretense. He accused Clint of being arrogant, of mistaking stubbornness for principle. He questioned what Eastwood had done recently to justify such condescension. He said the world had moved on, and that maybe Clint should too. The air grew heavier with each word. The applause sign operator didn't dare light up the cue. But Eastwood didn't respond with volume. He responded with clarity. He said, relevance wasn't about trending topics or viral clips, but about whether your words could stand alone without applause, without hashtags, without filters. And with that, he turned the question back on Jimmy, asking what legacy he was building beyond 5-minute jokes and guest appearances. It was brutal, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Fallon's smile cracked. His jaw clenched. He lashed out, saying Clint represented everything that was wrong with people who couldn't accept change. That this was why people no longer wanted to hear from him. That his opinions were no longer welcome. It wasn't a joke. It was personal, deeply personal. And it showed. What followed was no longer subtle. Clint narrowed his eyes and rose slightly in his chair, the posture of a man who'd spent decades walking through fire without flinching. He said Jimmy was confusing progress with performance, activism with applause, and that while he didn't expect to be adored, he refused to sit silently while being condescended to by a man who couldn't face himself without a laugh track. The energy in the studio flipped. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to unease. This was no longer entertainment. It was an autopsy of celebrity culture happening in real time, under studio lights. Jimmy tried one last deflection, throwing in a joke about Eastwood's age, but it fell with a thud. Clint didn't respond with outrage. He responded with something more devastating, disappointment. He didn't need to yell. His silence said it all, and in that silence, Fallon realized he'd lost more than control of the show. He had exposed himself, not just as a man unable to go toe-to-toe with Clint Eastwood, but as someone who never expected to be challenged by substance. The audience, once firmly in his palm, now watched with conflicted eyes. No applause, no laughter, just the hum of realization. Something rare was happening, and they were all witnesses. As the lights dimmed momentarily for a scheduled commercial break, the energy in the room didn't retreat. It stayed thick in the air, as if even the studio itself didn't know how to recover. Jimmy turned to the producers off camera, his voice, low but sharp, his expression revealing cracks beneath his polished surface. Clint remained in his seat, arms crossed, legs still, eyes scanning the studio like a soldier surveying a battlefield he had already won. When the cameras came back on, Jimmy tried to reset. He offered a forced smile and shifted to lighter topics, hoping to bury the heat beneath segments about movie trivia and celebrity impressions. But Clint didn't follow. He stayed fixed, his silence now more confrontational than any insult. The audience, sensing the awkward imbalance, didn't respond to Jimmy's jokes the way they used to. Laughter was thin. Claps were hesitant. The crowd was no longer laughing with Jimmy. They were watching him try to survive. Then it happened. A woman in the front row stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't cheer. She simply nodded toward Eastwood with quiet approval before sitting down again. The ripple that followed was unmistakable. A few others clapped, not with wild excitement but with intention. The old actor had struck a chord. Jimmy noticed, and the smile on his face faded into something colder. He turned back to Clint with a different tone now. Less showman, more desperate. He accused Eastwood of hijacking the show for personal grievance, of trying to make himself look noble by tearing down a host in his own house. He pointed out that he had built this platform, and that Eastwood was being disrespectful by not playing along. It wasn't just defensive, it was wounded. Jimmy had never been forced to defend his legacy on his own stage, but Clint didn't flinch. He spoke again with precision, explaining that respect wasn't owed just because a man had a platform. It had to be earned, moment by moment, in truth. He said Fallon had spent years inviting people to laugh, but never asked them to think. And maybe, just maybe, America needed less laughter and more reflection. The audience responded, not with wild applause, but with a knowing stillness. Fallon tried to rally. He brought up Clint's past, dragged old controversies into the light, hoping to smear his credibility. He listed quotes, referenced dated opinions, and tried to pin Eastwood to an image that no longer held weight. But Clint's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more resolute. He said he was proud of standing his ground through storms worse than Fallon's cheap shots, and that he had outlasted critics more clever, more brutal, and far more powerful than the man sitting across from him now. Jimmy, increasingly agitated, turned toward the audience and began asking rhetorical questions meant to mock Clint's position. But this time, the laughter didn't come. A few eyes in the audience looked down. Some looked away entirely. The tension that had once made them lean in was now making them uncomfortable, and that discomfort was no longer directed at Clint. Suddenly, a voice from the back of the audience called out, not loud, but clear. A man simply asked, "Why are you attacking him?" It wasn't part of the show, it wasn't scripted, and it stopped everything. Jimmy's head turned sharply. He tried to brush it off with a joke, but it landed dead. He was losing the room moment by moment. The crowd had come for fun, but they were witnessing something different, something real, and many of them were no longer sure who they were supposed to be clapping for. Clint sat back, still not triumphant, just focused. His calm made Jimmy's frantic energy look theatrical. The divide was no longer generational. It wasn't old versus young. It was substance versus surface, meaning versus noise. One man sat grounded in decades of weathered experience. The other stood atop a stage he could no longer control. The power had shifted, not through volume, but through presence. Jimmy had brought a star into his studio expecting a light-hearted chat. What he got was a reckoning. And the audience, once his greatest, ally, was now slipping through his fingers like sand. Jimmy Fallon wasn't just uncomfortable now, he was unraveling. His usual composure, the slick rhythm that carried him from joke to joke, from guest to guest, had fractured. He shifted in his seat, eyes darting between Clint and the audience, sweat beginning to betray him beneath the studio lights. For years he had mastered the art of appearing effortless, but on this night, in this chair, across from this man, that mask was slipping fast. The producers were in his earpiece, urging him to wrap it up or change direction, but Jimmy couldn't. Something deeper than ego had been touched. He needed to win this, not for ratings, not for the cameras, but for pride, for relevance, for the identity he had built around always being the man in control of the room. He looked Clint straight in the eye and made a final push. He accused Eastwood of being a relic, someone whose presence on the show was only tolerated because of past achievements. He said times had changed, and voices like his needed to be phased out so others could be heard. It was meant to silence Clint, but instead it exposed Jimmy. The audience didn't flinch at Clint's presence. They flinched at Fallon's desperate need to erase it. Clint's reply was measured, unflinching. He said that being heard shouldn't come at the cost of silencing others. That growth meant learning from voices with experience, not rejecting them out of fear or fashion. He warned that in this new age of curated outrage and disposable opinions, the real danger wasn't in saying something wrong, it was in saying nothing that mattered. The room had gone beyond quiet now. The crew wasn't moving. The cameras weren't cutting away. No graphics, no sound cues. Just two men, one stage, and a crowd witnessing something rare, a cultural turning point disguised as a talk show segment. Fallon snapped. He stood up mid-interview, pacing the stage, mocking Clint's stoicism, calling him out for being self-righteous. His voice rose. His jokes turned cruel. He laughed at Eastwood's films, questioned his morals, even belittled his fans. It was a meltdown disguised as performance, but no one was buying it. Not anymore. Clint stayed seated, his gaze steady, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't respond to the barbs. Instead, he waited. And then, with the room hanging on every breath, he calmly said that the stage didn't belong to whoever shouted loudest. It belonged to whoever stood for something when it mattered. That was the breaking point. The crowd, once hesitant, now began to shift fully. Applause started, not in waves, but in sharp, meaningful bursts. Not everyone clapped, but those who did so with the conviction of people who had just watched someone speak, a truth they didn't know they needed to hear. Jimmy froze. For a split second, the panic was visible. He was a man used to applause on command, and now it came uninvited, and not for him. He turned to the audience and tried to salvage the moment, but the charm was gone, the rhythm broken, and in the silence, between his attempts, his irrelevance echoed. Clint finally stood, not out of anger, but finality. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply gave a nod to the crowd, then turned his back to Jimmy and began walking off stage. No mic drop, no theatrics. Just a quiet storm leaving the room as it came, in control. But as he reached the edge of the set, Fallon called out once more. It wasn't defiant. It was something closer to pleading. He asked Clint if he thought they could still find common ground, if people like them could coexist in the same world without tearing each other down. Clint stopped. The crowd held its breath. He turned slightly and said, without anger, that coexistence didn't require everyone to agree. It only required people to listen. And if Jimmy had truly listened tonight, then maybe, just maybe, it hadn't all been a waste. Then he walked out. Fallon stood alone on the stage. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just watched as the curtain metaphorically and literally began to fall. A man who once ruled the room had been left with nothing but his reflection. And for the first time in a long time, even that looked unfamiliar. The studio remained eerily still after Clint Eastwood's departure. The applause had faded, the lights hadn't dimmed yet, and Jimmy Fallon stood in the center of the stage like a man lost in his own show. There were no jokes left to tell, no cameras to hide behind. What remained was raw and uncomfortable, and it was real. The crew behind the scenes didn't know whether to cut to commercial or let the moment linger. Producers whispered into headsets, but even they hesitated. For the first time in years, the script had dissolved into silence. Fallon adjusted his suit jacket, as if trying to slip back into the persona that had just been peeled away. But there was no recovery. The audience sat still, not out of politeness, but reflection. Then, slowly, the crowd began to rise, not to cheer, not to boo, but simply to leave. Some paused to glance back at the stage. Others just walked quietly to the exits. They hadn't come for a confrontation, but they had witnessed something more valuable. A man who built a legacy on grit and honesty had just walked out with more dignity than any monologue could manufacture. And the man left standing on stage had been exposed for what he was when the cameras stopped flattering him. Backstage, the tone was even more unsettling. Members of Jimmy's staff avoided eye contact. Some whispered in corners. A few quietly gathered their things and left without saying a word. The illusion had been shattered. And once something like that breaks on live television, there's no taping over it. Jimmy eventually returned to his dressing room. The energy that once followed him into every room was gone. He sat in front of the mirror, the reflection cold and unfamiliar. He replayed Clint's words in his mind, not just the harsh ones, but the honest ones. There was no malice in Eastwood's approach, just a refusal to be dismissed, a refusal to be turned into a caricature for the sake of a laugh. Later that night, social media erupted. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire. But what surprised everyone was how divided the response was. For every comment mocking Eastwood as outdated, there were 3 more defending him, praising his poise, his clarity, his unwillingness to cave to shallow performance. Hashtags trended. Think pieces were written. But at the center of it all was one indisputable truth. Jimmy Fallon had been changed. The following week, Jimmy opened his show differently. No flashy introduction. No band. Just him, seated at his desk, with a faint trace of humility. He spoke not with punchlines, but with something closer to vulnerability. He acknowledged that the interview with Clint Eastwood hadn't gone the way he expected. He admitted that he had misread the moment, maybe even misjudged the man. There were no applause cues, just quiet listening, and for once, that was enough. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood remained silent. He didn't give follow-up interviews. He didn't explain his actions. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any quote, and while Hollywood churned forward with its usual distractions, something had shifted. People began rewatching his films, not for nostalgia but for the themes buried inside them. Courage, integrity, consequence. In the end, Clint didn't just walk into Jimmy Fallon's studio and cause a stir. He walked in and reminded a generation, addicted to applause, that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that refuses to perform. The confrontation may have started as a clash of personalities, but it ended as something far more enduring. A lesson, one that neither man will ever forget, and one that viewers around the world felt deep in their bones. And for those who watched it unfold, not as entertainment, but as revelation, it was clear. That night wasn't about 2 men arguing. It was about what happens when the truth walks into the room and refuses to be left off the stage.